Welcome to the camp history presentation created for the Freedom Historical Society, and it was presented there on July 29th, 2026. I am Karen Falk Vitek, and I was a Calumet camper from 1970 to 1972, and then I started working there in the summer of 1973 as a junior counselor, and then since then I've held many different positions: unit leader, nature, arts and crafts, and swimming department heads, family campground manager, and retreat weekend volunteer. The land that Calumet stands on today, the original inhabitants were the Ossipee tribe of the Western Abenaki people. The name Ossipee translates directly to water of the pine place or river of pines. Also, Ossipee Lake was originally known as Great Ossipee Pond. So when a farm was created there, it was named the Pond Farm, and it was in existence from 1948 to 1870 and beyond. It was approximately 110 acres, and one of the men that owned it was Zebulon Pease, who was the first postmaster of Freedom. He also was elected to different positions in the state government. In 1870, while living in Madison, Henry Pascoe purchased the farm from Frederick Bradbury. And on this slide, you can see a picture of Henry Pascoe with his wife, Philemon Doré Barshaw Pascoe, who was born in Quebec. They married there in 1864, and together they had 12 children, which would be quite enough to help run the farm. The picture on the right shows the farmhouse, and over here on the right, a little bit hard to see, are Henry's two brothers, one of them being Richard, who worked with him quite often. Henry Pascoe was an interesting person. He was born in Cornwall, England in 1835. He was a miner there and a self-educated engineer. The area of Cornwall, England had a lot of mines and a lot of miners, but there was also a gold rush and silver rush and other mining things happening in the United States, so he came to this country when he was 21. And besides having this farm, he carried on mining operations in locations across the United States and also in Nova Scotia, Canada. He was in Colorado, California, Vermont. He was involved as the manager of the Silver Lake mine, also known as the Madison Lead Mine, and the Diamond Ledge Gold Mine in Sandwich, which he tried to revive in 1903. Often he worked with his brother Richard on these projects. And sometimes some of his sons. One son was involved with the Sandwich Diamond Ledge Gold Mine. And at one point, the Pascoes owned most of the land on the northern shore of the lake, all the way from the end of Calumet's property to what that time they called Rocky Point, and we refer to today as Cody Point. I was able to go down to the UNH Special Collections Library and view an account book from Henry Pascoe. This first page that is shown was from 1882. There were two gentlemen. One was Lyman Reed Blake, who was an American inventor. He revolutionized shoemaking by creating the first machine that was capable of sewing shoe soles to uppers. So that made that process a lot quicker. But he didn't have the capital that he needed to promote it on his own. So he sold his patent rights to another American inventor and industrialist, Gordon Mackay. He sold the rights for $8,000 in cash and a share of future profits. Gordon Mackay was involved in the shoe industry also. And like other industrialists, well-to-do industrialists of the time, they were looking for ways to invest their money and make more money. And one of those was in mining operations. So they ended up hiring Henry Pascoe to work his mine, manage the mine in the Gladstone mine in Silverton, Colorado. And it lists some of the expenses there and the agreement that they had to manage that mine. The second picture shows expenses to travel for Henry back and forth to Colorado by train. He would get on the train in West Ossipee. Now, a little background on summer camping, especially in New Hampshire. In 1881, a Dartmouth student named Ernest Balch started the first ever sleepaway summer camp in the U.S. called Camp Calumet, which was in Squam Lake. He was seeing young men staying with their parents and being waited upon on those fancy hotels up in the White Mountains. He bought this island to create a summer camp for the sons of these families where they would cook, clean, build, and do everything themselves. There was some cultural anxiety existing during this time that the boys were experiencing a sedentary city life and that the home life was making American boys weak, coddled, and soft. So camps that started during this time, starting with Balch's Camp Calumet, they were promising to make boys stronger, more self-reliant, and disciplined. One of those in that vein was Camp Wellesley. It was originally started in 1898 on Lake Wentworth, and then it moved to land that was purchased from Henry Pasco on Ossipee Lake in 1899. It ran until 1919. And it was purchased and developed by Edward Benner, another interesting person. He was mostly an educator, born in Maine, graduating high school from Lowell, Massachusetts, and then going on to Amherst College, taught some prep school, and then graduated from the Andover Theological Seminary. He was an ordained minister. He taught math at different colleges in Missouri and Colorado, and then he became the head of the Salt Lake Academy, which was a non-Mormon Christian school. Then he was elected to the Senate of the state of Utah, and his efforts there helped to create an excellent free school system in Utah. Around this time period, towards the turn of the century, there were still a lot of private schools, but they were working towards a public school system for everyone in many different locations. But in 1891, he decides to return to Massachusetts, and in 1892, he starts the Wellesley Homeschool for Boys in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and that ran to 1910. He had a very serious educational philosophy with early youth outdoor recreation. He had them campers engage in nature study, manual training, sailing, target practice, and mandatory daily camp maintenance to build personal responsibility. So here you can see some ads that were for his Wellesley homeschool. In 1903, he decided to combine school and camp by offering 2 terms of school at Camp Wellesley. In 1904, the first permanent camp buildings were erected. The plan of transferring the school to Freedom for 2 outing terms is in harmony with advanced ideas and is approved by prominent educators and is thought to be of the greatest boon that can be offered growing boys. One little interesting note about probably one of the most prominent campers that he had was Booker T. Washington, Jr., who was somewhat of a scoundrel. And there are letters back and forth between Booker T. Washington and Edward Benner discussing this situation with his son. By 1910, he decided to devote all of his energies towards the camp. And so the school was closed and he spent all of his time focused on the camp. The final years, this is an ad from 1918. And one thing I want to point out is right here, it mentions that his management are J.C. Booker, principal of the Peekskill Military Academy. Just keep that little thought tucked away. The final year was 1919. There were challenges after the First World War. And also Edward Benner was in his 70s. And so what he decided to do was sell it to another prominent educator, Walter Bentley. Walter Bentley was looking to make a sister camp to his successful boys' camp, Camp Wyanoke on Lake Winnipesaukee. So he purchased it, starts Camp Winnemont, and that went until 1964 when it was sold to the Franson family, who then converted it into the Wabanaki Campground, which is still in existence today. In this postcard, you can see the main building there that dates from 1904. That building is still at Wabanaki and is probably, if not the oldest, then very close to being the oldest still existing building that was started out for camping. Another little interesting thing that I've come across is this Camp Whittier, which was located on Lake Ossipee. It was started in 1898 by Elmer Ellsworth French, who was from Porter, Maine, and his wife, who was Blanche Kate from Effingham. They're both teachers, and they were working at the Rockland Military Academy that eventually moves to West Lebanon, New Hampshire. And his camp also moves at that time in 1904 to Lake Muskoma in Enfield, New Hampshire. But there are definitely some solid leads to show that that may have been the first camp that was on the lake, to have predating Wellesley by 1 year. Where it was located on the lake, we're not exactly sure, but it could have been some of the land that Henry Pasco may have loaned to him. There's nothing in deed records to show that Mr. French bought any land. So it's all sort of conjecture. He was working at that time at the Rockland Military Academy, which was on Nyack-on-Hudson along the Hudson River. It was, very active school in the 1890s and early 1900s. But eventually, there's a lot of competition. You're going to hear about Peekskill Military Academy, which is in Peekskill, New York. There was a New York Military Academy, which is still there today along the Hudson. A lot of competition. So what he decides to do is combine with a New Hampshire Military Academy, and it's moved to the former Tilden Female Seminary at Seminary Hill in West Lebanon. And the camp moves to Point Comfort on Lake Muskoma. So if anybody ever sees anything about Camp Whittier that can give us a definite location, I'd be very interested in that. Now, Camp Ossipee. This is the very huge building that Henry Pasco made. And at that time, when he built it, it was known as the Ossipee Lake House. But he decides to sell, and in 1903, it's purchased, and it becomes Camp Ossipee. It was purchased by a gentleman named Henry Bateman Young. He was born in Dedham, Massachusetts, where he graduated from high school, and then he went on to Harvard, starting in 1899 and graduating in 1904. His claim to fame really was that he was an important runner on the track team for Harvard, and then eventually it goes on to the Boston Athletic Association. The key here is that he taught at the Wellesley School for Boys, and then he was at Camp Wellesley, so he would have been familiar with this property. So that in 1903, he purchases the property to start Camp Ossipee. Also, he was involved with his brother at the camp, or his brother was involved with him, Walter Harding Young, and eventually his brother takes over the management of it in 1910. Henry, or sometimes known as Harry, moves to New York City in 1913 to become a broker and work on Wall Street. And then, very unfortunately, at a young age, he dies of pneumonia after contracting the grip in 1915. The only picture we have of Henry Bateman Young, H.B. Young, Harry Young, is this one of the 1904 Harvard track team, and he's right up here. He participated in the Harvard-Yale team that went to England and defeated the Oxford-Cambridge team in 1904. His event was the 880-yard run or the half mile, and that's where his claim to fame was, really. So his camp, he was really focusing on a lot of the sporting events. We do have this account from a parent that visited his son at the camp in 1903. This article came from the Meriden, Connecticut Daily Journal. These boys came from prep schools, and in this case, the boy came from Choate in Connecticut. And it says, Camp Ossipee is a little bit different from other camps. It was in that it takes in not only boys, but their mothers and sisters as well. You can see that huge long building, part of that was used still as more or less a hotel that the mothers and sisters could come up and stay in, as well as other guests. There were other buildings on the property also. So and here it says that he was the year before connected with Camp Wellesley. It talks about 2 cottages occupied on the shore besides a building in which they eat. It's 4 miles from the West Ossipee Station, and it has a telephone and teams of its own, and that means teams of horses. There's boats and canoes on the lake. There's a ball team, which you'll see is a very important sport to them, baseball. And they like to be winning. It says there they have played the best clubs in the neighborhood without so far losing a game. And they also take 3-day trips to Lake Winnipesaukee to play some of the teams in that region. The other thing that they did that first summer and summers after that was climb or hike up to the top of Mount Washington. There was a newspaper produced on top of Mount Washington, first in the Tip Top House, and then later it moved, after the fire of 1908, it moved to the base station of the Cog Railway. And this first time, as Camp Ossipee going up, they talk about needing 5 teams, and they came to Jackson, where the ladies were lodged in the house, and the boys either in tents or in the barn. And then they went on, pressed on to get to hiking. Some, went up the ravine and others on the glen, and they all made it to the top. After a short rest, they headed back down just as the rain began. This newspaper was something that was created as something that people could take as a souvenir from their visit on the top of Mount Washington. The newspaper was the first ever summer resort newspaper in America, published daily on the top of Mount Washington. This was during that golden age of hotel tourism in the White Mountain regions. But, just during the summer months. It was moved after that, like I said, that fire in 1908. It ran from 1885 to 1917, when World War I caused the COG to cease operations. And I was fortunate to obtain the 1907 brochure, which had a lot of photographs in it. Here's a picture of the young men after morning exercises. This is what they call an assembly hall inside one of the buildings. And here you get a different view of just how large those, what they call 3 cottages were. But the porch, the wraparound porch, connects all of them. One thing that he always advertised was that they had their own electric power plant. So here's a picture of the dynamo and engine. And as I said before, playing baseball was a very important activity there. These look more like the counselors, the senior team, and they would have the emblems of their college or prep school on their uniforms. There was saddling, get out to race horses. They also described a steamer launch, and here's a picture of it that was on Lake Ossipee. It wasn't actually owned by the camp, but by a gentleman called C.E. Merrill. He married the daughter of the Pascos. Her name was Phyllis, and they lived in Tamworth and Freedom till at least 1910, and then after that moved on to Franklin, New Hampshire. The first steamer launch that he had actually sank. It was the Mayflower. It had a leaky valve. And that was in the first White Mountain Reporter's little snippet that I have here was from May of 1899. And then in 1903, he was getting his steamer Ruth ready for the summer. So in likelihood, that previous picture was of the Ruth steamer launch. You can see it again here in this picture to the left, and then there are really giant sailboats and other boats there, and then a diving platform along the lakefront. There was tennis, croquet, basketball, and there was also a mandolin club and other musical clubs with different musical instruments, but I thought this one was interesting. There was a big carnival called the Asquam Carnival. It was at Camp Asquam. Squam Lake was originally known as Asquam Lake. And in 1906, it was a very big celebrated water festival and athletic regatta that was held on Asquam Lake in Holderness, New Hampshire. They had a decorated boat parade, an illuminated night parade, canoe and rowing races, swimming and diving events, and even musical and theatrical performances. And it mentions here that the governor awarded 13 prizes to Camp Ossipee boys in senior and junior events. Usually it was just the camps that were around Squam Lake at the time, but Camp Ossipee had been invited that year. And here are some of the prizes that were won, not only at that carnival, but also during Old Home Week. I would love it if we could ever locate one of these awards. It was also a year-round school with winter sessions that started on October 1st. There was ice boating, winter golfing on the lake, snowshoeing and skiing. Notice how skiing is spelled Skeeing. They skated with ice sails, and they went tobogganing on Seabury Hill. Here's the senior baseball team again, and you can see that they're standing in front of a wagon. This is what was known as a resort wagon. You can see too that there's another one right over here on the right, but one of them is still in existence. It's located at the Skyline Farm in North Yarmouth, Maine. It's a nonprofit organization. The land of this former farm is conserved, but they have a carriage museum with an antique carriage and sleigh collection, which includes this Camp Ossipee canopy top box or resort wagon. There's a link there where you can see a video of this wagon where the guide goes into great detail about the different parts of it and how it was used. And in all probability, besides carrying the baseball team around and also taking them up to Mount Washington, and it probably picked up the boys at the West Ossipee Whittier train station and brought them to camp. In this postcard, you can see a picture of that big building on the left is what they referred to as the camp house, and then some of the tents that were along the lakefront. So in 1908, another parent goes, this lawyer Harrison. He went to his son's camp, talks about it being open the entire year and acts like a preparatory school. The life is mainly out of doors, and the course includes plenty of exercise on the lake and in the woods. Talks about several large buildings connected with the school, and the winter term finds full classes, hard at work getting an agreeable mixture of out-of-door life with their book studies. Mr. Harrison also went on a little auto trip through the surrounding country. So for those of us that live in the area and survive frost heave season every year, I thought his comment about that while he was enjoying his auto trip through the surrounding countryside, he pronounces the roads the worst ever. Macadam seems to be unknown, and the hills are straight up and down. Also in 1908 is a huge, huge fire. This is the replacement inn that Henry Pasco or his sons built in 1912 to replace what they lost. That huge, long building that you saw with the big wraparound porch burns to the ground. The fire caused at least $12,000. I've seen it reported to be as much as $25,000, but everyone escaped safely. It was such a huge fire that was reported across New England. The first article there is from Lynn, Massachusetts, and the other one is from the Kennebec Journal in Maine. So it was quite big news, a very large building like that burning. In 1910, his brother, who is Dr. Walter Harding Young, takes over the running of the camp. HB is left to go to New York City at that point. Walter attended Tufts Medical School, and then he was an instructor at Tufts College. He goes on later in life to become a pretty highly regarded ear, nose, and throat doctor. But he marries his wife in 1910, Ethel Hardy, and they both return to run Camp Ossipee. And in these ads, it talks about a resident doctor and a camp mother as one of the pluses for this camp. However, they were trying to sell or rent the camp for a few years, and then finally in 1913, they sold the camp. It was sold to a Frederick Fessenden, who had founded the Fessenden School in 1903, which is still in existence today in West Newton, Massachusetts. So in 1913, we begin the Fessenden years. There is not a lot of information about Camp Fessenden. There were 3 men that Frederick passed the reins to run this camp. They were Walter North, John Porter, and Ralph Pierce. They were masters or teachers at the Fessenden School, and the school was actually for very young boys that were preparing them for secondary schools and other prep schools. So in this picture, you see a group of young boys. There are not many boys in this camp, but it had to discontinue after the summer of 1917 because the United States had entered World War I. And this, not only for Camp Fessenden, but a lot of other camps, created staffing shortages because the young men were going off to war. These 3 men all eventually enlist in the war effort. And there was also rationing and travel restrictions. The one interesting note, though, is that John Porter, after the war, he comes back, he does some teaching, but in 1924, he founded Camp KBN. It is located on Lake Winnipesaukee in Alton Bay, and it's still in existence today. It celebrated its 100th anniversary a couple years ago. Originally, it was called Mr. Porter's Camp, but his mother thought that was a very boring name, so it was changed to Camp Cabian, which is from the poem Hiawatha, and it refers to the west wind, so they have a west wind publication. And after being closed for the war, J.C. Booker, who, if you remember, was managing Camp Wellesley in 1918, he decides to buy the camp. And that went from 1919 to 1938. Another interesting person, he graduated from Princeton University in 1890. He was a teacher, was at different schools. He actually taught at the university in Syria. He becomes principal, though, in 1903 of the Peekskill Military Academy in Peekskill, New York. As I mentioned, there were a lot of these military academies. They started sprouting up after the Civil War, and they were intended to create discipline in young men, and a lot of them had, would hope to get into West Point, which was also along the Hudson, still is along the Hudson. So he wanted to modernize the camp. Oh, one other thing, I want to go back to this. His first marriage was to Florence Van Dyke, who he met while he was teaching at what is known as the American University in Beirut. Syria. And at that university, at the time that J.C. Booker was there, her father was teaching there. They had a son in 1905, and then in 1908, they had twins, a boy and a girl. Unfortunately, and very sadly, Florence passes away just a little over a week after the twins were born. So not an easy life being a principal, a camp director, and 3 small children. But in 1923, he wanted to modernize the camp with a new set of buildings. So in 1925, the Cleveland Dining Hall was completed, and the caption was, "Where a president of the United States once loved to fish, now stands Cleveland Hall." But did Grover Cleveland actually have a fishing shack where the dining hall stands? Here we see Grover with his fishing rod. After speaking with George Cleveland, his grandson, who lives locally in Tamworth, and other references, Grover really preferred the quieter places for fishing like Connor Pond in Ospey, which was one of his favorites, and then Duncan Lake, where he did have a cabin. But he did fish on Lake Ossipee. This article came from the Muncie Evening Press in October of 1905, but it ran in other papers because it was a syndicated story about a former president. It said that Mr. Cleveland and his friends spent a night at Pasco's Hotel and tried it, meaning fishing, the next day. Mr. Hobbs, being the unknown fisherman of the party, was assigned to the boat which contained Richard Folsom Cleveland, which is George Cleveland's father. At the time, he was the 9-year-old son of the former president. The first day out, the lad was high fisherman, showing 2 beautiful pickerel. And the next statement may lend some credence to why this dining hall was named after Cleveland. After that experience in Ospey Lake, it is doubtful if the former president would care to go fishing anywhere in Carroll County unless he knew that Mr. Hobbs was sure to be along too, thinking that that would bring him good luck in his fishing. The other thing is that Richard Cleveland, the 9-year-old lad that you see in this picture, he was an undergrad and grad student at Princeton. Grover never went to college, but he was a trustee at Princeton and he had strong ties to Princeton. J.C. Booker was also a Princeton grad and he had strong ties with Princeton. So it's probably that Princeton connection. J.C. Booker wanted to sort of puff up the profile of Camp Ossipee because there was a lot of competition to get campers to come there. The other thing he did, interestingly, is he counted all the summers since H.B. Young founded the camp in 1903 as, continuously being Camp Ossipee, which is kind of interesting. And also another way to kind of puff up the profile. This is what the inside of the dining hall looked like. They would have banquets there at the end of the season. This is the picture of the original camp house that was from that postcard I had showed you. At night, they would get their evening mail there. And it was like sort of the hub where the offices were for the camp. But in 1932, they completed a new camp house. We at Camp Calumet Lutheran now call it Luther Hall. It's still in existence. This back porch is not there any longer. It was enclosed. But it's pretty much looks very similar to today to what you see in this picture. They went boating. They had swimming with a spectacular diving platform that would make today's camp directors quite squeamish. They did hiking trips also, going up to the top of Mount Washington. And they had musical groups. Here you can see a little orchestra playing, and then they're inside the camp house. Mr. Booker's there on the stage all the way to the right, having a concert. An interesting note is that in 1925, during Freedom's Old Home Week, the orchestra and chorus held a concert to benefit Freedom's First Christian Church. And then in 1926, they held a concert to benefit Memorial Hospital in North Conway. Here are the tents that they stayed in along the lakefront. So here's another interesting person. Her name when she was born was Nellie Frances Hodges. She was born in Maine, Washington, Maine. She moves to Lynn, Massachusetts, and graduates from the Emerson College. She was a fairly popular children's book author, but in 1914, she opens up Pine Knoll Camp for Girls on Iona Lake in her family summer home. If you go up Route 16 and you see that red building to the right of the Hotopia sign, that's where Pine Knoll Camp was. Her first husband passed away in 1915, and then she marries J.C. Booker in 1924. It's possible that J.C. Booker was looking for a girls' camp for his daughter and met Frances that way, or just being in the camping environment, they may have met that way also. After they marry, Pine Knoll Camp becomes the sister camp of Camp Ossipee. So they would advertise, if you have a daughter, send her to Pine Knoll. And then in a Pine Knoll's brochure, they'd say, if you have a son, send him to Camp Ossipee. They're sort of a little camping power couple. Another interesting note is that her granddaughter was Carolyn Roberts Kennett. Her mother was Elizabeth White Roberts. She taught preschool in Intervale, and in the 1980s, she was on the staff of the Conway Public Library. You may recognize the name Kennett. She married into the locally pretty well-known Kennett family. But by 1938, J.C. Booker was ready to retire from camping. He was 73 at that time, and he wanted to move on from camping, but he remained at the military academy right up until he died in 1945. At that time, there was another camp, Camp Calumet for Boys, first founded by Robert Callard on Crystal Lake in Canaan, New Hampshire, on the site of a former girls' camp. He worked with his wife Gladys as directors of that camp. But in 1938, the camp is destroyed by a hurricane, and they're going to start looking for another property. His nickname was Chubby, and another person they had on staff that he partnered with was Farron or Doc Ellsworth, and they purchased Camp Ossipee in the December of 1938. Chubby graduated from Springfield College in 1916. He served in the Navy during World War I. He taught physical education, and he was in the schools in Hackensack and West Orange, New Jersey. And in 1943, he and his wife Gladys sold their half share in Camp Calumet to Doc Ellsworth. And there's evidence to show that they may have done that because Gladys was quite ill and died a few years later. Doc Ellsworth was a student and graduated from the University of Minnesota. He also serves in the Navy during World War I, and he taught industrial arts in West Orange, New Jersey, the same district where Chubby was teaching and being an administrator. So probably because they knew each other there, Chubby talks Doc into coming to work at Camp Calumet in 1928 when it was still on Crystal Lake. In the summer of 44, though, he becomes the owner and director, sole owner and director of Camp Calumet. Some people always like to know what this propeller is doing in Luther Hall above the stage. It was donated to camp by Richard Pascoe, who was a grandson of Henry Pascoe. He was a pilot in the Royal Canadian Air Force during World War II, and for many years was the postmaster in West Ossipee. He and his wife owned and operated Shawtown Campground for a long time. So this original historical settlement of Shawtown was founded by the Shaw family. So Richard's grandmother, Annie O. Lawton, she inherited lands that were passed down directly from these Shaws that started in the 19th century. And that's why they were able to start this campground in Shawtown. But Calumet boys would go there for overnight trips by canoe. They would call it their outpost. Here are some pictures of their different cabin and tent groups. And here you see a picture of the staff all in their button-down shirts, long sleeve shirts, and ties. The camp did a lot to help out the surrounding community during the war years, and to do their part to help out. There were many of the young men in the area were enlisted in the different military divisions, and these young boys would go to the trucking farms to help with weeding and picking vegetables. And after those trips, they would end it with a swim and a movie. They also did more canoeing trips that didn't require camp vehicles as requested by the War Transportation Department. Another change they made was that the metal shop, remember Doc Ellsworth's the industrial arts teacher, they would make these planes out of metal, but in the war years, they sort of start turning out plastic items when metal was scarce. Here's the campers creating these boats, which was a very popular activity. Calumet still has like a few of these boats that have been donated back to it. There were different sizes, different, a lot of them were sailboats. Some had 2 sails, some had 1 sail. But at the end of the summer, they would take them out and run them in the lake. So here's another interesting person that was at Calumet. He began his years at Calumet in 1944. His name was Earl Gardner. But before Calumet, he spent 10 years collecting butterflies and other insect specimens, and actually a lot of other specimens. So because of this collection, the nature building became known as the Bug House, and it's still known as the Bug House today. He also had one of New Hampshire Fish and Game's first wildlife rehabilitation licenses, and he would take these raccoons for a walk with a harness and a leash, and even take them for a swim. He was at Calumet taking care of animals until 1956. And here you can see in the back wall these framed insects. They were under glass. They were still there when I was working in the nature department in 1970s. They were into boating. There's a picture of the original boathouse on the left, and then another picture of the waterfront. But there were other shops. Remember, Doc was an industrial arts teacher, so there was a leather shop, there was the boat building web shop. Here is some pictures where they're starting to make things out of plastics. And the things that they made throughout the summer, because the boys would stay for the whole summer, they were to be, some of them at least, were used as gifts for their parents at Christmas time. The campers participated in lots of inter-camp sporting events. In 1945, Doc decides to give these emblem awards that are made out of felt. They were for just about every different kind of activity that the camp offered. They could sew them on their sweatshirts, or in this picture here, you see like a small banner that they could also attach them for. That letter C was awarded for outstanding performance in baseball. Usually the campers would meet in Grand Central Station. Remember, Doc and Chubby were from New Jersey, so they pulled campers from the school systems that they worked in. They'd meet at Grand Central Station and ride the train to the West Ossipee Mount Whittier Station. But in 1945, a group of campers flew from New York to Boston, where they then met the other campers on the train to go the rest of the way to camp. Also, this is a picture from 1955 where the campers are returning home by plane. They're at the Laconia Airport. We have one of the original camp songs and cheers booklet from Camp Calumet for boys, and to this day we still sing the Boom Chicka Boom cheer. That's the top one on the page on the right. But by the late 1950s, Doc and Mrs. Ellsworth Vola were ready to retire and sell Camp Calumet for boys. This picture is taken in 1957 at Christmas time. They would send a booklet of the camp stories from that summer to each of the boys. They would stay at Calumet and the director's cottage up until a little bit after Christmas into January. This was after he retired from teaching but was still running the camp. So what were New England Lutherans doing? Well, they were camping too since the 1920s. There were Lutheran League camps in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and in Connecticut. Then there were Bible camps that were held on Lake Webster in the late 20s. There was also a new camp chosen at Geneva Point Center on Lake Ossipee in 1930. But in late 1947, they decided to buy Camp Webster on Lake Webster, and they renamed it Camp Lutherwood. On this slide, you'll see some pictures of Lutherwood. But they sell the camp, and then they're looking for a new camp. The camp was sold, and in late 1959, after a lot of traveling around to different camps that might be available, this gentleman, A. Swanty Johnson, scouted out an appropriate camping site when he found Camp Calumet. That September of 1959, William Weaver Jr. and others from the Windsor, Connecticut Lutheran Church surveyed the site from the air, and you can see that the plane landed in the water along the beach, and they took some aerial shots of the camp. These pictures are from the first summer that the Lutherans were camping there. You'll notice that the buildings don't have what we have now, the white trim. They were red with green trim. The cabins that you see in the upper right picture were added during the Calumet for Boys era. Here's a closer picture of what the trim looked like on those buildings. And in the upper right-hand corner there, you see a picture of all these pennants hanging from the rafters in the dining hall. The counselors and different staff members would bring a pennant from their college and hang it in the rafters. Here's a couple of pictures of what the waterfront looked like, and the Lutherans developed their own outdoor chapel. Doc Ellsworth stayed on to help the Lutherans during the first season in the 1960s, pictured there on the right. In that picture, he's the gentleman on the left. One thing he didn't really quite understand how it was going to be successful with having both boys and girls, a co-ed camp. Even though, he believed in camping for girls, the sister camp for Camp Calumet for boys was Camp Allegro on Silver Lake. Here's some more pictures from those early years, and you may recognize a pretty well-known Freedom resident in the picture on the right. Girls also, were here. They're listening at bedtime to their counselor. Another picture of the outdoor chapel as it began to look. And then we had sailing. So over the years, camp has done a lot of different things to expand programs and facilities. We've been there for 67 summers now. In the 1960s, the property across from the resident camp on the other side of the street was purchased to create a family campground, which has been expanded over the years. In the 70s and 80s, buildings were maintained, expanded, or renovated. Even the infrastructure was updated. And then we also added spring and fall retreat weekends where groups would come up to camp. New buildings were created. The one building there on the upper right is one of our most recent buildings, the Oasis, which gives us a lot of indoor space, especially when the weather is inclement. And there's always something going on at Calumet. year-round. If you want to know anything about the programs at Calumet, you can go to calumet.org and learn all about it. Many people enjoy Calumet. You don't have to be a Lutheran to enjoy the programs at Calumet. So as we come to the end of the presentation, I just want to appeal to you that if you have memorabilia of any of the camps in Freedom or along Lake Ossipee, you can donate it to the Freedom Historical Society or to Camp Calumet, and we will make sure that the memories are available to people in future generations. Thank you for listening to this program.